Yeah.
But if they create a buffer around them where their natural areas there are healthy and there's a reduced fuel load, when that fire does hit that buffer, it drops down in intensity and it provides an opportunity for us firefighters to get
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you work with landowners in the Les Hills to do stuff that would prevent, grab chairs, guys, there's down there, to prevent, someone lives up in the Les Hills and they come to you and say, I know you're doing prescribed burns and stuff, what else can we do to minimize fire in our warehouses?
Well, one thing we're doing is teaching these landowner fire ecology workshops so that we teach people about the role of fire in the community, and then we also teach them how to use fire. That's easily translated to how to defend against fire.
Okay.
Because the tactics that we use to contain a prescribed fire are the same tactics that we use to put out a wildfire.
Okay.
So very easily transferable. And then the other thing is there's a program, a national program called FireWise. I don't know if you've...
FireWise. Somebody write that down. We'll have to look that up. FireWise.
If you just Google FireWise, that has all kinds of information for homeowners to create defensible space around their home and their buildings. And it talks about removing flammable vegetation. It talks about how to do the landscaping in your yard and things like that to protect from fire. It's focused on the western fire environment, out in the mountains and out west. But the principles apply here as well.
Okay. The I don't know if you remember. I don't know what year it was. The wildfire that went through up by Carson.
Yeah. 2005, I believe.
Okay. Did you get called in on that at all?
We did, very late.
Okay.
It started about 11 o'clock in the morning. We didn't get a call until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And by the time we got resources together and made it over there, it was about 5 o'clock.
How could that be prevented? How could that have been? You've been the first line of defense, I would think, because you have the expertise in fighting that kind of a fire. Or was it just the intensity and wind? Or
well, certainly it was kind of all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up.
Okay.
It was extremely dry conditions that were leading up to that. The topsoil was really dry. It hadn't been moisture for quite a long time, so all the fuels were dry. And then on that particular day, it was warm, very windy. It was in March, and so it was before anything was greening up. And so it was just ripe for a fire. There's nothing we can do about that. I think the important lesson that needs to come out of that fire, and I think some of that lesson has been learned, is one, training is so important. Really, the first line of defense is the volunteer fire departments. And most of the training that they get, if not all of the training, is related to structure of fire and EMS, rescue.
Right.
Very little wildland fire training. And wildland fire is different than structural fire. And many times we see fire departments overwhelmed by a fire moving across the landscape because they're accustomed to a stationary fire in a structure. And so it's a different animal to manage. And I saw some things that were happening that day that indicated that the command structure and everything was just overwhelmed. The other thing is that command structure itself is important for people to be able to work in. And when you go out west and work on a wildfire, it's just a very different system than we see here on wildfires. It's a command structure that's well rehearsed, well practiced, and all of the firefighters integrate very well. They know their role and they perform their role. And we don't see the same discipline, the same, the same ability to function in that system here, especially when something's running and gunning like that. And then the tactics. The tactics, again, like I said, mostly structural oriented, and the wildland tactics are so different. We have to be well rehearsed in that.
Okay. Kelsey.
What trees burn the best? Like dead trees or live trees?
Dead trees certainly burn better. Juniper trees, or many people around here call them cedar trees, they can burn really hot. The deciduous trees don't burn as well.
What about like live trees?
what live tree is?
The juniper trees, when they're live, they can burn, especially coming out of the winter into the early spring, because their fuel moisture is very low. Even though they're alive, they're pretty dry. But as soon as you start getting spring rains, in fact, you can see it if you watch the cedar trees in the spring. They'll have kind of a brown color to them. They're still alive, but they kind of look brown. And then as soon as you start getting some warm rains, they green up, and they have a lot more fuel moisture then, and they don't burn as well.
Okay, so for you guys that have just recently arrived, what questions, we've listened and learned lots, what questions do you still have about wildfires that Chad could answer because he's an expert in working with the wildfires? Jacob, you can ask another one.
So, you know how cedar trees, they kind of, I don't know how to say this, attack other trees and make them grow better. How would that affect a wildfire?
That's a really good question. What we have found is that the cedar trees tend to crowd out the other vegetation. And so if you look under a dense stand of cedar trees, there's very little growing underneath them. And the fuel that's really carrying the fire and allowing it to spread across the landscape in this part of the country is the leaf litter and the grass. And where those cedar trees are and there's nothing growing under them, that means there's no fuel. So oftentimes the fire will get to that area of dense cedar trees and just go out because there's no fuel. But if there's something to carry that fire with enough intensity and enough heat into the cedar trees, then they can burn really hot.
Okay.
Oftentimes, though, after the first few trees burn, it just dies down. It doesn't sustain itself, it doesn't continue to go through the trees, unless there's a really strong wind behind it and their fuel moisture is low. So, the fire environment is very dependent on the conditions. It's dependent on the weather conditions of that day. It's dependent on the amount of moisture that's in the system from previous weeks and months, and it's dependent on the condition of the fuel on that at that particular moment and how it's structured, how it's laid out, and how dry it is.
Do you have any of your training like online, like electronic that a person can?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do the S130, S190 is online.
Oh, okay. But like with your landowners and stuff, do you have any like recorded sessions that people can go and watch?
I don't think so.
They pretty much have to come face to face? Okay. Okay.
You remember when I said earlier that I'm not very good at technology?
Well, but I was thinking this is a very technology-laden group.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought they might have some suggestions on how to make that so that people can sit in their slippers and watch and learn and figure out on their own time,
right.
Even to make more of an impact, because your message is really makes a big impact. But
they can figure it out.
Yeah.
I have found that these minds at this table are a lot smarter than this mind, especially when it comes to technology.
Okay, other questions? Allie, Misty, Ramey, you guys came in late, but I know that you've been thinking about wildfires because we spent a lot of time focusing on, and last week on Monday we went through, there really, as we talked about, 3 different phases. One is preparing and preventing, which you shared quite a bit on preventing tonight. The next is how to survive that, which you guys found some cool things, and much of what you dealt with was smoke, like trying to evacuate and getting in areas. Who was it? Was it somebody?
Surviving is Kelsey, me, and Ramey.
Yeah, and you guys came up with some really good stuff.
If you're in a car, you have to shut all the air vents and make sure all the doors are closed.
And the windows are up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so surviving or be able to evacuate. And then the third one is rebuilding, or again, I just think it's such a great thing that if it burns on a regular basis, then you don't have that intensity of the fuel, you don't have the intensity of the fire kind of a thing.
Yeah, and one of the things, especially out west, is that, and really truly right here too, is that when you have a catastrophic fire, a wildfire that burns through an area where there's an unnatural accumulation of fuel, you do damage to the soils, and it's already, that whole plant community is already in a degraded condition, and it affects your hydrology. And so oftentimes when you listen to the news and you hear about a fire out west, they're concerned about the watershed. They're concerned about a fire burning in an area that is draining water to a lake or to a river or something that is providing drinking water for a community. Or when you have good, healthy fire in that watershed and you're stimulating those plants, you have healthier root systems which hold the soil better and promote infiltration of the water. When it rains, the water goes into the ground and gets cleansed and slowly drains to the rivers and the lakes. But when you have an unhealthy system and the root systems aren't healthy, the water is washing across the land and carrying sediment into the rivers and the lakes. And then when you get a wildfire, it carries soil and other sediment. It carries a lot more of it, and so it pollutes that source of drinking water. And it's not unlike what's going on here in the Midwest. Our natural areas are really good at building soil, holding soil, and holding water, and then slowly releasing that water to the streams as cool, clear water. But as our natural areas have degraded over time, and as we've replaced them with corn and beans, the water runs across the land instead of into the land.
And it builds up the silt and all
It builds
that.
up the silt, but it also promotes catastrophic flooding on a more frequent scale. So our rivers rise faster and fall faster, much more violent flooding. And we have a tendency to blame the rain and say, oh, it rained too much. But it's not that it's raining too much, it's that we've changed the landscape and it can't deal with the water like it's supposed to.
Okay, Amy.
Can fires happen like just from heat, from being really hot outside? No?
It needs some kind of ignition, a spark. And when it gets really hot outside and somebody's mowing grass and they hit rock with the blade and it sparks, that could potentially cause ignition. But you need that spark. You need that ignition source to get the fire going. You can't just spontaneously combust.
Misty.
Yes.
What's the best wildfire region you ever?
What do you mean by the best?
Like where wildfires happen most often?
Florida.
Really? I was in California.
Yeah. Florida has the highest frequency of lightning strikes in the country and extremely flammable vegetation. And Florida can burn at any time of the year. That's why we go to Florida to train,
Oh.
because we like to go to Florida in the winter.
That's a good choice anyway. How prevalent is water sources when you're fighting fires out in the...
Out in the mountains,
Yeah.
we were fighting a fire this summer in Montana, and there was just a trickle coming down the mountainside, and so we made a dam to back up some water so that we could have some water to work with. Oftentimes there's no water at all. And so sometimes we'll be working with a helicopter that is, it has a bucket suspended from a cable underneath the helicopter, and it will dip out of a lake or a stream, and it will fly over the fire, and then we direct it from the ground, and we say, okay, we need you to drop water on this part of the fire or whatever. And so sometimes we use water that way. Sometimes we just put water in a 5-gallon backpack and we hike it up the hill. Other times we'll use pumps to pump water through hoses up the hill, or we use engines to drive the water there. And many times there's no water at all, and so we just dig line and put dirt on it and mix the fire into the soil and put it out that way.
Oh.
Yes,
If you did have water, what's your favorite way of transporting water?
with an engine. Yep. Yes.
Like sometimes like the helicopters come around, they drop all the chemicals. Do they usually do that when there's water, or like when the firefighters have water or no water? Or
Usually when we need water, that's when we're using the helicopters. If we can get water to it without the helicopters, that's a little bit more effective. It's better to squirt the water from a hose because you can be a lot more accurate than dropping it from the sky.
Yeah,
And it's cheaper.
Did you guys see a picture or something where they're dropping some kind of chemical and it got on the firefighters?
It was
The
like
retardant?
Yeah.
Is it red?
Yeah.
It's called retardant.
Does that bother the firefighters a lot, or no?
It just turns us red.
Shower when you get done, I guess.
Yeah, we got slurried or sometimes people say we got painted. Yes.
What's the worst place to be during the
In it.
Yeah, that's what
No, when we're doing our training, we oftentimes we look for topographic features like a box canyon, which is kind of a dead-end canyon, because wind tends to funnel there, and the fire can be much more intense moving up through that, or narrow canyons, saddles where you've got a ridge line, but there's a dip in the ridge line. That fire and the wind can kind of funnel right through there. So those are really bad places to be. And areas where there's really heavy accumulation of fuel. Those are another area that we want to try to avoid. It's a good question.
Okay, any other questions? We've done a lot to exhaust you tonight, but this is great information.
Work snack?
Huh?
Work snack?
Yes.
Oh,
Ready
yeah.
snack.
Yes, we need to have snack. But first, let's do one thing, though.